So yeah, then let's start into this session. I just want to introduce you shortly to the audience. Most of the people, I think, haven't seen you yet in the workshop you gave. You gave this 3 parts workshop on machine learning, on style GANs during this AI autumn workshops I organized together with Guillaume and Guillaume's class, right? So it was a pleasure to be there and to be bombarded with all this information about how we could actually use these models to our advantage. And I just want to introduce Derek also to the audience as an artist, as you write down for yourself. You are an artist and programmer. You're living in New York City, and you are doing a lot with machine learning, doing a lot with style GANs, etc., and producing some artificial images in the end. And recently you just published together, I think, with the New York Times and other newspapers, some illustrations or also some pictures, but you're also leading some machine learning classes by your own. That's what I can say about you right now. I'm very happy that you're here and you're right now having a time frame to talk about your work in the end, not only the practical thing and not only how to do it, but what you're doing in the end. And I'm curious about what you are going to present. If you don't know Derek Schultz, maybe you visit also, or if you want to know more about his work later on, you can visit also this artificial images website, which I sent you already with the email. Or Derek is also in possession of a YouTube channel and a very active Twitter account, I guess. And there would also be chances to have a glance on his work in other ways or on tutorials how to deal with this stuff. Right, then would really love to give you the word and give you the chance to present your stuff, right? Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Yeah, so first off, thank you so much for having me. It was really great to do the workshop. I know I threw a lot at everybody, and hopefully you were able to take away some of that. I know some of you will be following up and doing more with this work in other courses and classes. So yeah, I hope that you found that to be a deep dive, but a way to get started with the various materials and a way to start thinking about machine learning and how to produce images and artwork with it. One thing I should note is I'm a little under the weather this week, so if I apologize for sniffles and coughs, I will try to minimize it or mute myself before any bad ones happen. But yeah, heading fall here in the US, so I'm definitely catching both allergies and maybe a cold at the same time. Yeah, I just thought I would go through some of my work and talk a little bit about sort of maybe a fictitious or like way for me as I think about how I produce my work and what I'm working on. Maybe a little bit of a timeline or maybe how a lot of it connects. Because I'm both in my like day job, I'm a product designer, and you know the history of my work. And I'm sure many of you being in university are like, what's next for me or what happens when I graduate? And I can talk a little bit about my own career path and how machine learning has come into it, but also just like sort of you know being my art practice outside of work, like how the two overlap or how I think about things. So with that, I'm going to quickly just share my screen and we can get started. And obviously, like I'll also say, please interrupt me if you have questions. I'm happy to just stop and answer questions as is. I plan this for about an hour, so 45 minutes to an hour. So we'll also have questions at the end. So if you do want to hold them, you're more than welcome to as well. Great. So yeah, I'm really happy to be talking to you. I actually wish I could be there, and maybe eventually in the future we can actually do this in person. I'm the school I actually went to is, I would sort of describe as, maybe post-Swiss. The design school I went to learned from a lot of people in Basel and other places, with a famous Swiss design background. So actually, uh, y'all have probably moved on from all of that work, but I think it's kind of interesting that there's a little bit of a connection to Switzerland. I want to actually start with one of my favorite designers, who maybe you know, maybe you don't. And I'm going to butcher his name as well as where he was born. His name is Eric Nisch. He was born in 1908 in Lausanne. And, I bring him up because I think, one, it's an interesting connection to y'all. But two, he's also like, I've collected much of his work. Probably since college, I've started a collection of just collecting material that I find of his. And I think he's just a really fascinating designer. And I want to talk specifically about one project, which is he, in 1960, he made a book called Dynamic America. This is my copy. It's pretty beat up. And it was designed for General Dynamics, which was now is a military contractor here in the U.S. And I guess at the time it was probably a military contractor as well, but it was maybe thought of a little differently. And Dynamic America was a book that he produced with the sole idea or conception of being about connecting this brand new sort of science-based military company to all of the history of science before it, or history of technology and invention. And it's highly regarded by a lot of folks as maybe one of the best examples of book design in the 20th century. I know a couple of famous book designers who have said it's like, a copy they return to all the time. And what I think is really fascinating about his work is, again, it was about, this modern company, but he connected it to the past. And a lot of these pieces are actually images and artwork that he collected throughout his own history, throughout his own career. He was apparently very obsessed with flying machines. So he spent a lot of time detailing flying machines in this particular spread. But one of the things I think is most fascinating about this book is that it wasn't supposed to be a book to begin with. It was actually supposed to be a film, and maybe like more of an educational film or sort of that sort of thing. If you've ever seen any like Charles and Ray Eames films, it was probably supposed to be something on that level. But for whatever reason, the budget got slashed, or they changed design ideas, and it became a film. And you can actually see that sort of in the legacy of the book, and the way that it, a lot of these things read right to left. There's a lot of these little like headlines and that sort of thing. But there's also a really interesting part, which is in the book, there are these little tip-ins, and each of them has a musical score. And the idea you could think of here is that actually these were the soundtrack. This is the music that would have played maybe when different scenes were appearing. And again, I sort of think about this as like, I think it's funny because it connects all of us in sort of like a Swiss American history kind of thing. But as I sat and sort of reflected on what I wanted to talk about in this lecture, I also thought a lot about how this book has really defined a lot of my own practice in multiple ways. One, in that I'm really, really interested in sort of connecting the past to the future, or the past to the present. I'm obviously a graphic designer by training, but I am really interested in film, or in the idea of motion. And I think like this book sort of again encapsulates so many of those concepts. So I just want to start with this, and then just sort of say like, maybe keep this in mind as you look at the rest of my work, because as I started to think about it, I was like, oh yeah, there's a lot of connections here. So if you've never checked out Eric Nisch's work, I highly recommend it. He did a really amazing poster series for General Dynamics that is like probably one of the fairly well-known sort of poster series from the 20th century. I should also say, with one warning, if any of you have photosensitivities, especially to strobing, or if you have auditory concerns about things like really glitchy noises or drone noises, there will be a lot of that in this work. So just to give you a heads up, I'll try to warn people ahead of time. But when I hit play on some videos, you may want to avert your eyes if it's an issue for you. So I'm actually going to start all the way back in university for myself. So this is now at least 15 years old, if not more. I think when I was in school, which feels like it was a very different time, even though it really wasn't. I was really interested in the idea of motion. I was working with, again, design folks who had gone to Swiss schools and then come back and were sort of teaching us at university. But I was particularly interested in almost this idea of like creating motion through static. So this particular project was like a motion graphics project, probably done in my 4th or 5th year. And the idea here was you had to make a poster, and then you had to animate it in After Effects. And I I have come back to this many times because I think like this sort of is what a lot of my graphic design work was, in that it was creating motion through static imagery. Um, but I always wanted to do more of the actual making things in motion. And for various reasons, I never felt like I had the tooling or the competency or the man hours available to do it. When I graduated school, I really thought that I would maybe get into motion graphics or something. And I moved to LA when I graduated school and thought, oh, maybe there's some motion graphics opportunities for me there. And then I learned a little bit about the history or the labor industry in motion graphics world, and I decided I like my sleep a little bit more than I wanted to be a motion graphics designer. But I sort of like I think this was like a pinpoint for me of like a point in my career where I was like, okay, there's something that I could do, but I just haven't figured out how to make it work yet. And maybe that'll come up over and over again as we look through more work. So instead of becoming a motion graphics designer, I sort of got into like programming, writing code, and then animating things using code. And this was a project that I did with a well-known author by the name of Hari Kunzru. I was working at a company called Atavis at the time, and we were doing animated books or like interactive books. This is sadly the only existing demo of this particular project because as with all things digital, it just hit digital rot and the App Store removed it, and now it doesn't exist. But I'll just quickly like show a little bit of what this is, and again, you can sort of see how maybe these things reflect upon each other in like a animating through static sort of world. So Hari and I, Hari wrote everything. He took a lot of the photographs, and then he and I sort of worked together on interactive ideas, sketches for these things. Um, and again, here was another potential future I thought I had for myself, where, uh, you know, this was 5 or 6 years ago when digital books were becoming a big thing, and there was an idea of like, this will be the future of books, and I sort of dove in headfirst into it, and didn't last very long as a career, but I thought it was really exciting. And again, hints at this idea of like, how do I create motion using design, or how do I, what tooling do I have available for me to begin to animate these things? And even in my personal practice of being an artist, I think even in my static work, I think there's a lot of motion involved within it. This is a project I do every year where I send Valentines to friends and other folks. This is from maybe 2 or 3 years ago, which uses a technique of chromatography, which is passing fluids through inks. And as they pass through it, it generates sort of different color textures and separates out the ink colors. So, again, even in static, you can see sort of the motion of these things. And the text itself is built around, this is built in processing. So these are pen plotter sketches to basically generate text. And I built myself a whole little tool to create sort of different animations of text. And I think here again, you can even see like, even though the static version is just more, different scaling of images, I really thought about it in motion. How I'm animating these things meant how the text is actually flowing, essentially. So again, I think there's been this long history of me sort of touching on things that I think begin to imply motion, but in static systems maybe aren't as clear to maybe other viewers. And I also dabble a lot in sort of dealing with programming. So again, to sort of combine the programming world with motion and video and that sort of thing. This was a quick demo I did a few years back where it was sort of taking a webcam and doing a lot of segmentation. Again, as I was preparing for this, I like came across all these things in my Vimeo account, and I was like, oh, wait, that actually makes a lot of sense. I'm now doing that again. I'm coming back to these things. So I think again, and maybe in your own career, like I think you'll find that there are ticks in the way that you work, and you return to them using different techniques or different applications. So for me, it's really funny to sort of like look back on this work and come back to it and be like, yeah, okay, now I see where I was actually headed with this. Um, and I did get to do some cool projects at the time, like sort of being commissioned. This is a commission for a company called Electric Objects, which probably would be an NFT company today, but back in the day, 4 or 5 years ago, it was a digital screen you could buy, and they would commission artists to produce video artwork for them. So here again, you can sort of see this is all built in processing, and I create animations, using a very convoluted processing script to make these happen, and then they were generated and published through the screen. So here again, you can sort of see my connection with my interest in sort of like early, Renaissance slash, scientific illustrations, while also doing these crazy sort of glitching effects and other things. But at this time, I feel like this was about the time where I feel like I was hitting a wall. I was sort of like, okay, I'm not the world's best programmer. I don't have a lot of time to write programming these days with my full-time job. What do I do? Like, what's sort of the next step for me? I also felt like there were way better programmers out there than me. And even though I think I was making interesting work, it just didn't feel like felt like I was sort of plateauing. And around that time is when I saw the work of Mario Klingemann. So I don't know how many of you have seen his work. But Mario is probably one of the earliest folks getting into machine learning art, but was also like a pretty well-known generative artist before that. And I saw this and I was just sort of like, okay, I got to figure out what the hell this thing is, and I got to figure out how to make more of this. And around that time, I think it was pretty much, I feel like the only people on the internet I saw a lot of Deep Dream work, I saw Mario's work, and I saw Gene Kogan's work. And Gene Kogan, thankfully, was posting his own lectures online. So I was able to check out some of those and sort of got a little bit of an idea about what this thing was. I was also very fortunate that because I live in New York, I was able to attend the School for Poetic Computation, which if you haven't seen SFPC, I highly recommend you check out some of their work. But they were doing like a 1 week workshop on machine learning. So I learned from a lot of these amazing folks. I mentioned this in my workshop previously, but if you haven't checked out these people, screenshot this and look up all their names. Really great people, and all of them are amazing artists, and I highly recommend checking out their work. But getting to learn from them, I was sort of like, okay, this was this very intense week-long thing of like, here's a bunch of things you can do. And then afterward, I was like, man, I don't know what to do with any of this. It feels like it's overwhelming. Probably much like my workshop. It felt overwhelming, and I sort of took a couple months off from it, and then I came back to it and was sort of like, okay, I really have to figure this out. I really want to sit down and like decide what I'm doing. And so my earliest works, these are some examples of really early work. Range from like, this is cool, but like it looks terrible, to like, this is interesting, but maybe feels like I don't have control over it, to getting to a place where I actually felt like I had more control over my work. And this is, to say that I think many of you will go through a similar path, whether it's in machine learning art or in other things. Like it's just always a challenge to get started in something new. You'll always feel like you're stuck, right? And then like at some point you maybe either you either hit a wall and you're like, I got to move on and find something else to work on, or you sort of hit a couple key points in the progress where you're just sort of like, this is great. How can I do more of this? And for me, I was really fortunate where like I felt like I was understanding a little bit of how the technology worked, as well as finding it worked a lot with my flow, in the sense that like, because I have a full-time job outside of producing art, this is a little hands-off, right? You tend to like feed these to a machine, wait a couple hours, and come back to it. So there's less hands-on time for me. So kind of just fit in with my current working style and what I was looking for. And from there, I've really sort of dug in to where I would say like most of my work today is done in machine learning. I still do a little bit of processing here and there, but it's mostly all machine learning. And over that time, I've sort of developed what I think is like maybe a language or a way to approach machine learning that I think would maybe help artists understand like how to think about it or ways to work with it. So I'll just quickly touch on a couple things, showing some work that I produced. So the very first thing is that you will often hear that machine learning can do X or Y, and my response will be, lower your expectations. Don't assume it can actually do that. This is a model called next frame prediction. The idea here is that it should be able to reproduce video that you feed it, and you will see it does not do a good job of that, right? It sort of like converts this flower to blobby things. But it's still really beautiful. And I think this is one of the keys of like maybe where we are today in machine learning, which is like embracing sort of the messiness of the tool, embracing how it doesn't really give you exactly what you expect it to, and you have to learn to work with that. And it sort of becomes more of a collaborative exercise than it is, um, something like where in code and processing or something else, like you're writing a very specific thing, and it almost always does exactly what you expect it to. Whereas in this case, you're getting this thing, and you get something back, and you're like, I don't know what the hell this thing is. How do I work with this? Which I think is a really it can be a struggle for a lot of artists who are not used to that sort of like flexibility. But I think it's really fascinating to work more in that area. And you'll see in a second where I actually use this model. Um, I also find that machine learning is great at doing what I call translation, which is that it can translate between things. So if you almost think about Google Translate and how you can translate from one language to another, and then when you translate back from that language back to the other language, always like slight shifts in the thing. I think that's a really great way to think about machine learning, which is that um, it's really powerful at translating, but what you're translating has to be, you have to think through what you're doing. This is a project I did right around the beginning of the pandemic. I had trained this model to produce images, like basically if you send me a photo of a person or a cat, then it can translate these into sort of these like floral textural things. So it's kind of fun, like right when the pandemic hit, everyone was like sitting at home on Twitter for days and days, sort of just like scrolling their news feeds, trying to see what was happening. So this was just a project I did one night where it was like, cool, everyone send me a photo of yourself, and I'll reply back with these images. And it was kind of just a fun, nice bonus, or like, I don't know, a present to give during the pandemic when everyone was struggling a little bit. So it was fun. People send me their cat photos, people send me their photos, and I was able to work with this. And I think this again sort of shows the power where, I trained this model. It took about a week to train this model, and then within minutes, people could send me photos, and I get to return something new back to them. And after a while, you sort of see like there's repetition in certain things that I'm cherry picking here. These are the good images. Other images didn't turn out as well. But I think it again just sort of shows the power of these tools. But again, because I am cherry picking, like there were some bad examples that just didn't work, and I had to be like, hey, sorry, this one didn't turn out, but here's some images anyway. But again, I think this highlights, maybe where this is a cool place where static images work. And I think this is a model that I end up putting up on Runway, which if you haven't played with Runway, I highly recommend you do. So anyone can use this model. It's on Runway today. And I think, again, it just sort of highlights maybe the fun, but it is sort of photo filtery, right? After a while, you're sort of like, okay, I've seen this thing over and over and over again. And I'll come back to touch on that because I think that's a common problem with machine learning, is that once you've seen it, it's kind of like, cool, that looks really awesome. And then after a while, you're just sort of like, okay, I've seen this over and over again. But one of the really powerful things I think that is cool about machine learning is that it does produce a lot of images for one model, right? So I trained a model. You'll see these flower images come up over and over again in my work, in part because I spent a lot of time building a data set for this. So this year's Valentine's Day project was I sent everyone flowers, or I sent everyone like an image of these flowers. And here again, you'll sort of see, like, I think there's this beautiful, interesting uncanny valley aspect to machine learning today, which is that you can see what it's meant to produce, and you can see how it's just slightly off, right? These flowers don't connect with their stems, or just like what's going on with the actual leaves themselves is kind of interesting. And then here again, you get this sort of like interesting sort of randomness. And this is a fun project in the sense that I was able to, using the model I trained for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, produce hundreds of images. Sent them to a printer, got them all printed, and then was able to send everyone sort of a Valentine's Day card. And here again, I think this like shows the power of these things, which is that they produce a lot of images once you've trained your model, and it's sort of like you can use these over and over again. But this is another place where I hit a little bit of a wall, because I know what my training data looks like, and you'll often hear people say like, this flower doesn't exist, or this person doesn't exist, or whatever it is. These things very much exist. Like, these are just like almost like glitched versions of the images that I've already sent the model. And I think this is a common thing that, again, machine learning folks tend to overplay or overemphasize, is that this is producing all new imagery. My feeling is that that isn't actually true. This is producing a lot of stuff that I've already seen, and it just so happens that most of y'all haven't seen these, so it's probably feels like it's new to you. And I think that this is one of the challenges of machine learning art going forward is I like to describe machine learning art as conservative, um, not necessarily conservative politically, although I do think a lot of people in the machine learning community are politically conservative, but the sense that because you're training a machine learning model on data, it's always looking backwards, right? It's always looking at stuff that that you've already shown it or that you collected. There is no there's no way of generating a brand new image from this thing. It's always taking from what you've given it before. And I think that that sort of moved me into like my next step of machine learning, which is like, okay, if that's true, like what are the tools or what can we do to begin to produce something that feels brand new? Or how do we sequence these things in a way that is something that feels new? Um, and it's not completely solvable. I would say, like, it's going to be a challenge in machine learning art in general. But one of the things I think is really fascinating about machine learning art is that, for me, it again touched on this idea of making images move. I could feed a static image into this model and eventually get out something that animated. So I think, as was mentioned, I did some animations for the New York Times probably about a year ago now. And these were done both in print, but also as animated little short animation loops for their website. And this is where I started to see that I was able to feed in static images into these models and get out things that animated. So here again, it sort of comes back to like, what tooling do I have available to me to be able to make things move? If I don't want to sit in After Effects and animate everything day in, day out, or if I don't want to learn a 3D program, or if it just isn't the right technique for what I'm trying to achieve. So these are these little looping animations. You'll see here is where my flowers came back in. So finding ways to sort of create these as collages or moving collages and finding small little short loops to begin to do something with. I find loops tend to work really well because I share a lot of my work through Instagram. That's actually where I get most of my clientele from. So you've got that like 15-second endorphin burst of like, here's somebody moving as you scroll through your feed. It tends to catch people's attention and it like gets them excited about what they could be doing when they collaborate with me. But here again, like again, to just like sort of highlight, like this is static images moving, and that just felt like something really fascinating to me and a really interesting technique or possibility. And one of the other big challenges I think with machine learning that I don't hear enough machine learning artists talk about is that these are really energy intensive, right? If you hear people talk about NFTs and how much energy gets used up from like cryptocurrency, machine learning is not that much better. So a lot of my work also explores how can I reuse these models that I train on for weeks at a time and probably burn through a lot of energy. How are they reusable? How can I find different ways of using them? So this is actually all the same model, doing different things and different techniques. So I think this just sort of highlights what I think is an maybe underexplored area of machine learning, but also a necessity of machine learning. I really want, especially out of my classes, I try to show everyone what's possible within a single model so that therefore, you know, you're not training 20 models and burning through a ton of energy and not getting out the full use or the full value of these tools as you go through them. And so as I mentioned, I hit another wall. I was a year and a half, 2 years into this work, and was trying to figure out like, you know, what's next for me. I think there's lots of really cool things that can be done with machine learning, but they always feel a little bit tech demo-y, right? There's this looping effect. There's a lot of these 3D models where they convert static images to 3D things. They feel cool, but in some ways they feel like someone's going to put this in an app and then you've got a little face filter or you've got a filter type of thing. But they weren't necessarily telling stories for me. You know, maybe tied with an article or an essay, they were telling a story. But there wasn't enough storytelling in this work for me. And I was trying to think about, you know, okay, what's next? Or like, how do I take this and transition this into something new? And I've always sort of been interested in experimental film or like avant-garde filmmakers. But as I started to see what I was producing here and thinking about some of my favorite work of maybe Stan Brakhage or other folks, I started to realize that there's a lot of tools and techniques that I think have interesting overlaps. So around this time, I started to really explore, like, you know, I knew Brakhage, I knew Maya Deren, I knew a couple other folks, but I really wanted to see what other people were producing in the experimental film world. So here's just a list of names of some people I really like. But I really just sat down and I started to explore their work, and I started to read more about how experimental filmmakers thought about how they produced film and how their films were either connected or disconnected from mainstream cinema. Um, and it really gave me a sort of a new perspective on my own work. And I think this is, again, maybe a place where it's important for all of us as artists and designers to think about, you know, how are we looking at our peers, right? Like across, disciplines, but also what are we looking at that is not connected directly to our discipline, and what are values and things we can take out of it that we can then apply to our own work. So for me, looking at all these experimental filmmakers over the past couple of years, I've really got a new sense of maybe how I can use machine learning to either tell stories or to explore conceptual ideas that I'm really interested in. And I think even within these particular filmmakers, there's a strong divide between those that use film and those that use video, and those that maybe are using more generative techniques. And it sort of got me thinking a little bit about the concept of film, video, and machine learning. And this is a very rough, approximate idea of how I think about it. Any film theorist will probably kill me for showing this as is, but I think there's an interesting concept here, which is that, especially in structuralist films, and you don't even know what structuralism is, but just know that a lot of filmmakers in the avant-garde experimental area think about things as the frame, right? So a single frame of a film reel is how they think about what they're generating and what they're working with. For video artists, a lot of signal processing, right? Because analog or digital video, there's a signal coming in, and how you manipulate that signal is what's really important. And for me, as a machine learning artist, I started to think about these things as spaces. So let me talk a little bit more about what that means. So again, structuralist films sort of propose that the film frame should be exposed to the viewer, right? It's more about uncovering the magic of film, right? As humans, we can watch film at 16, 24 frames per second, and our brain turns that into reality, or turns it into time. But for structuralist filmmakers, they're very interested in exposing and highlighting the fact that you're really only seeing one image at a time, and there's some trick of your brain that makes that all connect. So time is essentially a single image to a lot of them. For video art, it was sort of this idea that like time could be instantly altered or instantly changed via the signal, right? So you'll see a lot of real-time video projects where people are altering colors or images or other things. And for machine learning, my proposition is sort of that like time is really plastic. There is no beginning and end to things. There's just this concept of the space that you're operating in. And maybe to give that as an example, I'll show the first sort of film project I worked on, which is called You Are Here. And so this is just a one short minute of a 60-minute piece. I wouldn't necessarily expect everyone to sit down and watch that for 60 minutes straight. But the idea is that what I'm doing is I'm essentially taking individual images and using a machine learning model, interpolating between all of the frames. So there's maybe 20, 30 frames within a 60-minute film. And the machine learning model will basically stretch it into infinity. So over time, if you were to walk in and out of a room projecting this thing, you would see the images changing. But maybe as you sit there, it's moving so slow that you don't even necessarily understand or acknowledge that the images are changing. And this is like one of the magic, or I hate to use the word magic, but this is one of the interesting parts of machine learning, is that you can stretch things into infinity. So the process for this film was actually using maybe 4 or 5 different machine learning models. So the first model is StyleGAN, which just generates new images from previous existing images, using a technique called network bending, which then allows you to sort of rotate and stretch these models. and then a translation model, which is called Big Bygan. So this sort of just generated the individual frames for me. And again, it maybe generated 40, 50 frames. And then I ran it through this model over and over and over again to stretch these things into longer and longer periods of time. And well, the full piece is 60 minutes. It could also be 3 days. It could be as long as I wanted it to be, because to the model, it's just all data points. And those data points can be extrapolated into infinity. And to me, that's just a really fascinating concept within machine learning that changes time. Even as a filmmaker, if you record a film at 60 frames per second and then slow it down, there's still only 60 frames, right? And you can only record for so long because of the mechanical process of a film shutter. But with this, you can stretch these things forever and ever and ever. And I think that's an interesting concept and a challenge as an artist to be like, how do you work with something that is that plastic? What is the right length of time for anything? And how do you begin to utilize that challenge or that technology? And something like I was just also really interested in, I started to notice myself that I was really getting really interested in certain pieces of art. And I realized that I have like an obsession with people just filming waves. Maybe in like the boring art house world of just like people going and recording the beach. But I actually found that a lot of artists have utilized the beach or waves as a way to quote unquote generate imagery, right? We could think of this if we were looking at like processing or some other generative technology as like a fluid simulator. And instead of them writing code to generate a fluid simulator, they're actually just going and recording the ocean. So here's 3 projects from like, these are probably 3 of my like favorite avant-garde or experimental films. Patrick Carey's Waves, which is, he was a more or less a documentary filmmaker, but he made a 30-minute film for the BBC that was just him photographing the beach. But he finds just such beautiful imagery in it that it's not just like, here's a beach, but it's like, here's the detail of a beach. Similarly, Dan Sandine did a film called Wanda Wiga Waters, probably butchering that name, where he went out to, I think he was living in Wisconsin at the time, he went out and just recorded a bunch of beach waves. And he had invented his own image processing unit called the Sandine IP image processor. So he was running it through these really fascinating visual tools to sort of distort these things and make them look trippy. And lastly is Stan Brackage's Commingled Containers, which was actually a film where he had just learned he had gotten cancer. And after his doctor's appointment, he went to the water and just stuck his camera in the wash in a stream and just recorded what happened with it. And if you, I highly recommend watching that one because it's really amazing once you actually like know a little bit more about that story. But just the visuals he was able to produce are really fascinating. And so I wanted to make my own version of a water film. I won't show all of it, but this is a film called Surfing in Space. And so for me, this is silent, so I'll talk over it while you watch. For me, I think there's also something really fascinating about experimental filmmakers were often didn't have a lot of financial resources, so they had to make do with either found footage or recording things on the cheap. So for me, it was sort of like I found this video on a stock video site and ran it through my own processes to generate this imagery. And I'm really fascinated again with this idea of like recycling and reuse and remix because there's so much material already out there in the world. Do we really need to go out and record more video of the ocean, or can we use what already exists? Maybe that's just me being lazy, but I think it's still like sort of a fascinating thought or concept or way to think about things. I'll quickly skip ahead just so you can sort of see what the end of this looks like. So this uses that next frame prediction model, but what it does is every frame it zooms in a little bit more, and what you end up getting are sort of these like very trippy sort of infinite zoom sort of scalable images. I should say if you ever want to sit with more of my films, all of my films are on my website as well as on Vimeo, so you're more than welcome to. I know I'm quickly running through these things, but if you ever just want to sit with them and watch them, you're more than welcome to. And so I'd done all of these sort of slow moving pieces, and I find that most of my work is like a reaction to my previous work. So I was really interested in this concept of like, okay, I've done a lot of these slow sort of fluid things, like what should I be doing to change that? Or, I think you see a lot of machine learning models or style GAN models, and it's just those slow interpolations of things looping. I think that's great, but like I think I was sort of challenging myself, like what other opportunities are there to play with sequences of images in a way that are different from others that aren't just this looping system. So a lot of Stan Brakhash's work comes up for me because as he got older and as he hit more and more harder financial times, he was finding that he was just painting directly on film, and then he was recording it. And when you do that, you never really get this fluid motion because of the frame, right? There's always a skip as it moves through each frame. So he was also playing with rhythms and doing other things. And similarly, there's a wonderful artist by the name of Jody Mack, who I think also does this in her work, which is finding ways to take static images and making them move without it being sort of the trick of your eye of like creating like motion, but just to feed in static imagery. And again, I also find Jodie's work interesting because she's often working with found materials. She might be photographing them herself, but it's like finding junk or wasted computer chips or other things. And so I wanted to sort of take that to my own work and maybe also have something a little bit more to say. I think as a machine learning artist, you can sometimes be pigeonholed or thought of as being a techno utopian, or tech will save the world, or tech will save everything, or like science is the future. And I wanted to sort of say a little bit more about that, or like how I approach it. So I made this film called Linnaeus Pip, which we'll watch really quickly, and then I'll talk about it. And so one of the things I also have been sort of thinking about more in my own work is how do I sort of hide the machine learning part or the machine learning aspect of my work? I think it's totally fine to be front and center with machine learning, but I also think there's an interesting challenge or a unique opportunity to maybe like sort of bury some of the lead and really make the story or the animation or the visuals themselves sort of tell the story. So this is a project that, as I started to think more about the history of machine learning, you can also tie it back to the history of science as a whole. And if you go back to the dawn of science becoming its own field, you start to learn that a lot of the people who were really into classification and other image or other like classifying models of people, of locations, of types of animals, kind of find that a lot of them were racists or eugenicists at the worst side of it. And I think you hear a lot about machine learning being all those things as well. So in some ways, this film was a way for me to sort of connect the dots and say maybe almost in reaction to the Eric Niche book, which is trying to promote science as a positive for the world. It's also trying to highlight, for me, like this piece is trying to highlight that there's also a lot of challenges that we have to overcome. Um, a lot of the classification scientists of the early era wanted to classify white people as better than black people, and classifiers were a way to do that. And I think likewise, we see machine learning falling into those same traps. So in some ways, this was a reaction to that, as well as a way to sort of generate a new piece of art for myself. And the underlying tool behind this is actually, it is a machine learning model. You might not assume that because you're just seeing images reproduced from a data set, but this is actually a sorting model called LPIPS. And I sort of use this because, one, I think it's an interesting tool, but two, I also think it highlights that, like, what exactly is the machine seeing here? Why is it sorting these things in this way? Do we know? Could we guess? I can guess for some of these images, but I can't for others. And I think this leads to a really big challenge, and one that we as artists or we as the data scientists, as researchers, need to sort of unpack is like, what's going on behind the scenes here? And how do we begin to explore and think about it? And, this being applied to flowers, cool, who cares? But if this were being applied to humans or something else where maybe your job were dependent on what the sorting mechanism was, you yourself were being sorted, you might want to know what's actually going on behind the scenes. So here again, I'm trying to figure out a way to use technology to tell a story or to actually question what the technology is doing. And that's always a little bit dangerous, right? Because if you use it, it can look like you're pro using it, but you're also just asking questions of it as you do it. And so again, as a reaction to this piece, which I've worked with flowers and these sort of like botanical illustrations for much of my artwork of the past couple years, I've always been hesitant to work with bodies, in part because I find machine learning with bodies to be much more of a messy or dangerous discussion topic. But there's a really wonderful series of animated films and experimental films that do deal with bodies and often deal with them in sort of a progressive or um, reactionary way to the way that we expect bodies to look. So a lot of films of experimental filmmakers will, highlight through explosions of bodies or in distorted positions, or just reacting to sort of maybe what is expected of female bodies versus other things. And I wanted to sort of explore, you know, bodies as a topic, which is a challenge for me because it's not something I normally work in. So I made a piece that is called Looking for You. It's about 2.5 minutes long, so I think we'll go ahead and play it. I should say this one has a ton of strobing, so if strobing at all might affect you, like you might want to turn away for this one, but I can talk a little bit about how it works afterward. Oops, sorry about that. All right, had a big cough there right at the end. Sorry. So yeah, and sorry, I can't make it. I don't know how in Keynote to make anything full screen, and also it's very low res to begin with. It's about 480 by 640, so it's pretty small. So the concept behind this work, or like the technical side of this work, is actually use a technique called pose estimation, which just I feed in hours upon hours of dance videos that I find on YouTube, and it produces these key points. And these key points are, here's where the shoulder is, here's where the eyes are, here's where the hands are. And once I'm finished with this, I have about 2 million assets to play with. And then what I do is I feed in one video as sort of the guiding video, and I find all of the closest images from other videos or other data sets in this model, and then I'm able to bring those into After Effects and play with them once I have the connections. Um, so this, to me, sort of felt like, again, like you'll see in a lot of my work, there's a lot of collage, a lot of other techniques to combine imagery and those sort of things. But I found this, one, this was just a good challenge for me, but two, I think it was also about, when I show this to friends, they say, "Where's the machine learning in this?" Or like, I think like, to me, like that's a really interesting power, or like maybe a technique to begin to explore more, which is like, how do you bury sort of the machine learning in a way that you can still produce work that is pretty much impossible to do by hand, right? There's no way I can match every single one of these frames with a body in the same way in the same amount of time to do this work, but to be able to do that, but also produce something that still didn't feel like it was produced by a GAN or produced by a machine learning model, feels like a really powerful future work or future potential of these tools. And also, was really happy to find this data set of work. Someone had uploaded years of these Detroit techno dance videos, as well as a bunch of other videos from MTV and other places. And again, I like working with found imagery. I think there's some challenges there, or like just some really interesting quirks of this. And I guess the 90s are cool again, so I might as well like dive into that and like play up on that a little bit more. So yeah, I thought this really felt like, again, another breaking point or another tipping point for me to really explore new options and new technologies within this. And I'll wrap up with just one last project that I'm sort of in the middle of working on, and I'll talk a little bit more about how it is, but I shall say it is another one that strobes and flickers a lot, so just be prepared. And this one also has some drone noises that I generated using machine learning. So this project, it's titled Books or Datasets, in part because one of the things I like to highlight about machine learning is machine learning, like many technologies, tends to say like, we're brand new at these things. No one has ever done this before. And a lot of people talk about data sets and how the creation of new data sets or having access to data is sort of this big data technology has created this. And my refutation of that, or how I'd refute that, is that I think books have always been data sets. So this takes all of the patterns from an old pattern book produced in like the 1950s, and it takes it takes like small little crops of every one of these images. And by sequencing them, you can begin to see things move or not move, right? It gets back to that sort of Gestalt principle, or like that static images in sequence, your brain will try to animate. And I think there's just some really fascinating technique with that. One of the things I'm doing with that work is to also take a little bit of what I have learned in web design over the years, which is responsiveness. What happens when you take the exact same data set or the exact same images and crop them at different sizes or different scales or different speeds? So this series of films is actually it is a series of films, and each film uses the same data, but because of crops, or again, maybe the idea of like vertical video versus horizontal video versus 16:9 versus 4:3, you get different outputs. So this is almost like generative video making, where it takes a same data set and just applying different variables to it produces different films, and different films of different lengths. So you'll see here in the bottom right is a 16:9 film, and I believe it runs maybe 45 seconds to a minute. Whereas the top right film is a 4:3 film. It's cropped in much closer, and I think it runs for about 5 minutes. So this is, again, maybe playing with the concept of time, playing with the idea of like, what is a singular film? I think film has sort of escaped having to think about responsive web design or design across devices. And this is my way of maybe starting to get back to some of that work. You can actually see it if you scroll to the very beginning of this. Oops, let's go back here. Oh, there we go. So let's just look at the slide. So if you look at this slide, you'll see these images. Well, that didn't really work that well. You have to trust me. you can see from the very first frame that they are the exact same image, but they're all just cropped slightly differently. And as you go through the sequence, like things move a little bit quicker and a little bit faster depending on the crops. So this is work in progress. I have no idea what I'm going to do with this in the long run, but I think it's what to me feels really funny about this is that I'm actually getting back to a place of where I'm using static images, right? So at the beginning of my career, I wanted to make static images move, and now I'm getting a place where I want to make moving things static, but explore what those static things are and how they sequence together. Um, so in some ways, you always end up going full circle in your work. And I think this is particularly a project that I'm interested in because I think it ties together a bunch of random concepts throughout my career, but I think it creates something that's maybe an interesting question about how we begin to make films for the future. So yeah, with that, I'll say thank you. You're more than welcome to follow me on any of these locations. I'm happy to talk more, and I guess we probably have a little bit of time for questions. So if anyone has questions, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can talk about those.